Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show. Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss essential topics about the art and culture of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our 5th episode. I'm really excited to be doing an interview with G. Cooper, who works for the National Trust of England. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and what the National Trust is?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello. I'm G. I work for the National Trust in the UK. So its full title is the National Trust for Places of Historic Interest and Areas of Natural Beauty, which is quite a long title, but we just call it the National Trust for short. It's a charitable organisation in the UK, and it's responsible, as the name suggests, for looking after quite a significant portion of the UK's historic heritage, including over 300 historic buildings, including country houses, which is my sort of area of expertise. So working for the National Trust, my role is Collections and House Officer at Uppark, and my role is essentially responsible for the conservation and care of the house itself and the historic collection within it.
Fantastic. I think I misspoke. I did say of England, but the National Trust, I suppose, covers the entire UK then.
Yes. So, well, to be honest, actually, now that I think about it, the National Trust that I work for is more of an English-based organisation. There is a completely separate National Trust for Scotland, but the National Trust that I work for covers England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Okay. But Scotland has its own for some reason.
It kind of makes me think of UNESCO a little bit. Does it have like the same role that UNESCO has for like World Heritage Sites, but for the UK?
Yes, very similar. I mean, the one that comes to mind is Versailles, which I've been to quite a number of times, being a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is very similar because we have sort of a system in the UK where we have buildings that get listed, which means that they have sort of certain legal protections on them. And the National Trust cares for quite a number of these, which, have been given over to the National Trust by their former owners and have been sort of conserved and reopened back up to the public, so that everyone can enjoy them.
Wonderful. So far on this podcast, we've talked a lot about Italian art, principally painting and sculpture. But we've also done work with literature, but we haven't spoken at all about architecture. So it's really, really fun to use this format to start to talk about architecture, and also how the Renaissance is something that we can say is living, or something that continues beyond its own period. Because your specific area is 17th and 18th century? Is that correct?
Yes. So a bit of 17th century, predominantly the 18th century in English country house building.
Right. But there's a really substantial influence from a Venetian architecture from the 1500s named Andrea Palladio. And you know quite a bit about Palladio.
Yes, Palladian architecture, as we call it here in the UK, is, such an important part of country house building. I mean, the it sort of emerged in the early 18th century, particularly with a gentleman called Colin Campbell, who published a work known as Vitruvius Britannicus, which was heavily influenced by not just Palladio's work, but also the work that inspired Palladio, which was the Roman architect Vitruvius, which is where Vitruvius Britannicus comes from. But we also have a gentleman called Giacomo Leone, who does the first English translation of Palladio's most famous work, which is I Quattro Libri, or the Four Books of Architecture, which again also was inspired by Vitruvius's own 10 books of architecture. So there's quite the link going back from sort of the 18th century heyday of country house building all the way back to Palladio and the Renaissance, and even further back to sort of Roman architecture at the sort of turn of the first century, 0th century. I never really know what to call that period.
Right. Well, right, because I would say Vitruvius was writing in the 1st century B.C.E. That's how I would say that. But I guess he dies before the switch to Common Era. I think he does. I think that was his dates. I think Vitruvius is important, especially because the one thing that I like to drill home with all of our listeners is what the Renaissance is in a relationship with the classical world, or with the revival of classical culture. So Vitruvius coming back from the 1st century to influence the architecture of Palladio is exactly how we're defining Renaissance, right? So he wrote, like you said, Vitruvius wrote a 10-book treatise on architecture, and the first printed copy of that comes out in,
I think it's in 1486.
It's 1486, yes. Perfect. One of the major developments in the Renaissance was the printing press, and that is how texts were able to so easily get proliferated around scholarly savant circles, right? Not always common. Common people didn't tend to read as much as we hope to imagine in light of printing becoming more available, but that Palladio can access printed materials of ancient texts, and then transform that into his own specific type of architecture that we'll find in Venice. We talk a lot about Florence. I'm really excited that we get to talk about Venice in Vicenza. We generally will call it all Venice, because he was an architect for the Republic of Venice, which in the time period was a much larger space than just the city of Venice today. It included Vicenza, where a lot of Palladio's work is today, still intact. But Vitruvius, we can conclude the basics of his architecture by saying that Vitruvius believed that architecture should have 3 main functions, right? It should be beautiful, it should be stable, and it should be useful. Do you have anything that you'd like to comment about Palladio in terms of Vitruvius? Does Palladio follow those 3 principles with his architecture?
I think he certainly does, and I think you can certainly see the sort of the core elements of Vitruvius's architecture in Palladio's work. I think what differentiates Palladio from earlier Renaissance architects who had brought in classical elements from ancient Rome is he sort of tries to elevate it, not just in a sort of aesthetic way, but also almost in a physical way by building these palazzo and these villas in the countryside on these sort of hilltops, and often on top of a foundation. It's quite interesting, the concept of the piano nobile, which is what we would call in England the first floor, is seen as sort of the principal floor, and that was something that Palladio created in his villas to offer these fantastic views of the Venetian countryside. It's often commented that these houses work fantastically in the climates of Venice because they offer this amazing way for the warm air to flow through. And then when they're adapted for the British climate, they are significantly less successful.
That's an interesting point. Especially, I love how we pronounce things so differently. I'd call that the piano nobile, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is good vocabulary for art history students. The piano nobile would be in the United States, what do we do? Ground floor, first floor. No, first floor, second floor, right? So that'd be the second floor. In a lot of Italian city-states, the entryway to a palazzo, especially urban palazzos. I don't know about the country house particularly, but the urban palazzo or the palazzo within the city would have public access often to the ground floor. So the piano nobile is where the nobles, right, it's where you don't go, where the commoner can't climb to. And in this case, as you so astutely pointed out, can offer benefits for airflow, views, and this sort of thing, which is really, really interesting. But as you said, different in England.
Yes.
So is it fair to say that even within the English country house, based on these styles, that the piano nobile is still in effect, but the ground level wouldn't really be a public space, would it?
Yes. So oftentimes in the English country house, when they're designed, particularly with Palladian country houses, the best examples I can think of are Nostell Priory in Yorkshire and Kedleston Hall in Derbyshire. They're built with a rusticated ground floor design, which is another Palladian trope to have the ground floor done in a much more rusticated stone style, with the piano nobile, the first floor done in a much more refined style, often with the pilasters and the columns, and it is often of a much taller scale, with sort of very grand windows to offer the views out, often to the extensive parkland that these houses had in the 18th century, often with the loggia that are designed with the Venetian houses are often glazed over with windows to keep them a bit warmer in the English climate.
Windows, that's interesting because I was reading something about the Palladian window. Do you have any comments on that, on the structure of that?
The Palladian window, also known as the Venetian window, is quite a common trope in Palladian architecture in the UK. It's something that Palladio really refined and became quite a signature piece in his architecture, which is how it sort of shares his name as well as the Venetian name of the region he worked in. And they're incredibly common. A house that I know and love dearly, Claydon House in Buckinghamshire, which is another National Trust house. I should mention that the three houses I've mentioned so far, Kedleston, Nostell, and Claydon, are all National Trust houses. Claydon has its western facade, which is the ornamental facade, is absolutely dominated by this enormous, almost 25 feet tall Venetian window, which offers absolutely amazing views out to the parkland and to the lakes that Claydon oversees. So really, it's a hallmark. You know, when you see that window, you know what kind of house you're looking at. It's such a trademark.
We see that a lot with either windows or arches or vaulting. Your pointed arch is going to be for Gothic architecture typically, and your rounded arches tend to be Romanesque or classical, depending on when it was built and who influenced it. So I think that's an interesting point. I had another question about that, but I've lost it. So that's gonna be lame. It's okay. So what would we say are you talked about his quattri libri, right? His 4 books. What does he detail in those about how architecture should be, and how do we see that in the English country house, and even in relation to what the country houses he does in Italy, if you can comment on that.
Oh, that's a fun one. I think my understanding is that he very much relies on something. I believe it's known as the sort of the five orders, which is you have Corinthian and also later composite at the top, Corinthian, Ionic, and then I believe it's Tuscan and Doric.
That's it.
The lower down one. And these are almost like your building blocks for creating the perfectly classical styled home or facade. And you do really see that in Palladian houses in the UK with Doric and Tuscan features being primarily on, I mentioned the ground floor, that sort of rusticated style, with the Corinthian or Ionic styles being preferred for the piano nobile. Again, thinking of Claydon, which is one of my favourite houses, the saloon, which is the room that features this fantastic Venetian window. The interior doors feature these fantastic Corinthian columns with the capitals on top. And what distinguishes the Corinthian capital is it's designed to look like a basket that is overgrown with acanthus leaves. And funnily enough, the fireplace at Claydon in that saloon further tells that story of the supposed creation of the Corinthian order by showing, I believe it is a young girl who is crying over a lost loved one, and so she is transformed into, I might be getting this wrong, she was transformed into a basket that then overgrows with acanthus leaves, and the architect is passing by and sees this basket overgrown with acanthus leaves and is inspired. And that is all depicted in this fantastic sort of marble 18th century fireplace, and complemented by the room being covered with Corinthian capitals. So it's all encompassing. It's quite a spectacle.
So the architecture itself, like if we're to assume the fireplace as a component of the architecture, so the architecture itself, this is at Claydon?
Yes.
So the architecture itself is informing how we read the architecture of the room. Is that the way I understand it?
Yeah, it's the idea is, because 18th century aristocrats, the one thing they want you to know is how educated they are. And the height of education in that period is the knowledge of ancient and classical antiquity. And so to have not only a room decorated with these classical orders decorations, but to also have this fireplace telling visitors, oh, this story that I am aware of not only do I know how to use this decoration, but I also know where it came from. And, it shows the education. It's almost sort of a commentary on how educated the owner of the house is.
I remembered my other question, and they're related, so this is good. So I think back to Vitruvius, who I believe was aware that when he's writing treatises on architecture, that he is talking to the literate elite of his society. And that also Vitruvius was one of the writers to mention the five orders of that tend to be Greek. I'm incapable of telling the difference between a Tuscan and a Doric capital. I don't know if you have that answer.
There is no difference between the capitals. It is the base. And I will get them mixed up. It is one of them has a base and one of them doesn't. I believe a true Greek Tuscan. Well, this is the thing, because the Tuscan one is because Tuscany is obviously Toscana, is a Roman introduction, and it's a Roman refinement of the truly Greek Doric order. And the classically Greek Doric order doesn't have a base, so it is the column,
right,
with no base. Whereas the Tuscan order is the Roman improvement on that, adding a base. But my understanding is that the capitals are virtually identical,
just kind of rounded, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is good for people who aren't well versed in architecture to understand that a lot of times to identify what order a structure might be in terms of like Greek architectural orders, where you look at the capitals, but in this case, the capitals of columns, right? There's other elements, of course, but each one is something different. Like we were talking about the acanthus leaf, which has its own symbolism that I actually can't spout off at the top of my head why the acanthus is so important beyond the story that you told. If you see acanthus leaves in other types of work, they have meaning. I'll find that and maybe leave it in the show notes because it's important. So we listed what those 5 orders were. I just want to do it again for student notes and this sort of thing. But it was Doric.
Yes, so Doric is the lowest one, with Tuscan, and then we should do a shout out to the one we've not talked in detail about, which is Ionic. Ionic is I say iconic for having the scrolls at the top. So when you see a capital with the dual scroll design, that is an Ionic one. I believe from the region of Ionia, which is formerly in the Greek sort of domain, but it's now in modern day Turkey, I believe.
Okay.
And then you have Corinthian, which we mentioned, being the acanthus leaves. And then an interesting one is composite, which is where you combine the acanthus leaves of the Corinthian order, and you add what they call volutes, which are these where the corners of the capital are very, very pronounced, and they're pronounced into a scroll like the Ionic order, which is where it gets the composite name, because it's a composite of Ionic and Corinthian, to be even grander than either. So that's when you really want to show off.
Right. And as you kind of elevate through the Greek orders, the ornateness of the column capital becomes more and more detailed and more impressive and more difficult to sculpt, especially if you have a major colonnade that you're putting in. The other term that you used was rusticated stone. Do you want to talk about what that means and what it's for?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I say rusticated stone, so if you imagine when you're building something out of stone, you have your carved stones, which are sort of a cuboid shape, and you stack them up, and then you have the pointing, the mortar to keep them all together, and you'll get a relatively flush facade. Sometimes you get sort of, depending on how thick the pointing is, you might get sort of little recesses. The idea of rustication is to almost carve sort of a beveled appearance to the front of the stone, so that each individual stone can be seen as its own, rather than as a uniform flush facade, which is often much more sort of appropriate for a facade like the Piano Nobile, where you're adding sort of more decorative elements like pilasters and columns to it. But the bottom, to make it almost give this appearance of strength and a more solid foundation to it, it's the simple floor, like you say, it's the common ground in the urban palazzi. It's the public entrance, and often in country houses, it is the everyday entrance, or it's where the servants enter through, and it's where you would find servants' areas and kitchens and things. And so it is less prestigious than the piano nobile, which has the drawing rooms, the salons, the entertainment rooms.
Exactly. Really, really good. We talked in the last episode about the Pazzi conspiracy, and how Florence basically violently flipped on Easter Sunday when the Pazzi murdered Giuliano de' Medici in the Duomo, but that Lorenzo lived and was taken back to his palace. If you were to look at images today of the palace that still stands, it's called the Palazzo Medici Riccardi, because the Riccardi family bought it after the Medici. You'll find that the ground floor is built the exterior of rusticated stone. And that is, like G said, to give the appearance of strength or of a fortress, so that if someone's attempting an assassination coup on your family and everyone you can bar the doors of the lower level of your palazzo, and it looks like you're held up in a fortress. Now, when you go directly one level above that, you're usually looking at a smoother stone or stucco. Stucco is basically like today, a little different, right? So this is an important point for understanding Renaissance architecture, urban Renaissance architecture, but also I didn't realize that this was integrated into the English country house as well. Are there any stories? Maybe we didn't really prepare to talk about this sort of thing. Any moments in the history of these houses where they were put under assault? Is that something that happened to the country houses, or?
That's the period of Palladian country houses is actually one that postdates any sort of real conflicts in English sort of history. There is sort of a period. It's interesting to think that actually, because one of the pre the 18th century, in the 17th century, because one of the first conflicts that comes to mind when you mention about that is the English Civil War, which happens from 1642 until 1651. So that is in the sort of early to mid 17th century. And just prior to that date is the first real introduction of Palladian or English, Palladian or classical architecture to England in the form of the architect Inigo Jones, who is considered to be he builds what's called the Queen's House at Greenwich, which is now flanked fabulously either side by the Greenwich Royal Hospital. But right in the middle is this very sort of unassuming classical white house. And I do wonder if it ever was sort of besieged during the English Civil War, because it certainly did exist. But it does also have that rusticated style ground floor with the smoother first floor. It is quite a stunning building, and Inigo Jones was heavily influenced by Palladio. And sometimes the issue with later Palladian architecture is you wonder, are they getting their inspiration directly from Palladio, or are they sort of seeing it through an even sort of further lens, looking at through Inigo Jones? I mean, that's how influential it was.
So what was is it Inigo?
Inigo. It's a Welsh name. Inigo Jones was a Welsh architect.
Welsh architect, and Inigo, is responsible for Palladian revival, or had some.
I would certainly say that the Palladian revival and the classical revival in the British Isles was almost solely down to Inigo Jones. I mean, he was incredibly influential. He became a royal architect. I mean, the name it suggests, the Queen's House. I do believe it was built for Queen Anne of Denmark, who was the wife of James I. And later he would go on to build the banqueting house, which still exists. Both buildings still exist, but the banqueting house at Whitehall Palace, which is this fantastically classical building, which still stands in the middle of London. Though the palace complex of the Palace of Whitehall, which it was a part of, sadly burnt down in 1694. But it's a testament to how well he built it that it managed to survive, and it's absolutely fantastic. Amazing Paul Rubens painted ceiling. Again with the rusticated ground floor and the pilastered and heavily glazed, lots of windows on the first floor.
Yeah, I am a really big Peter Paul Rubens fan. Given how so many Northern Renaissance artists or early Baroque artists ventured to Italy to learn different techniques for painting, I think there will be a way to work someone like Rubens into an Italian Renaissance podcast if I stretch the limit as far as possible eventually. So this really what we're getting at now is the meat of this conversation. What I really, really want to bite into and tackle is we're talking neoclassical, we're talking Palladian, which we're not referencing as neo-Renaissance, right? Because it's too hard to distinguish whether a Palladian architecture is referencing Palladio or the classical treatises and monuments and architecture that Palladio was using in reference for his work. So can we define what neoclassic means for the audience, but also how neoclassic and Palladian are different?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, so some of the core differences is, as we said before, with Palladian, you have a group of British architects, Colin Campbell, William Kent, Lord Burlington, in the early 18th century, who are, looking at the works of Inigo Jones, and then by reference the works of Palladio, and then by reference the work of Vitruvius, and then adapting it themselves. So you have, Vitruvian architecture at its core, but then it is warped. It sort of travels through 4 generations before you get these sort of British Palladian country houses, and they make their own adjustments, as I mentioned before, adjusting Palladian designs from Venice to suit the British climate, and this continues for the first half of the 18th century, and then something quite amazing happens in the 1760s. You get the discovery of the ruins of first Herculaneum and then Pompeii, which are these fantastically preserved Roman cities. Pompeii is particularly famous for being completely encased in time by the ashes of Vesuvius, and so they're discovering for the very first time under the ashes these perfectly normal and average Roman homes, whereas before the only evidence that we had of Roman architecture, you think of these triumphal columns, you think of the Colosseum, you think of the Pantheon, you think of these fantastically ornate public buildings, which were heavily inspired, which did heavily inspire the Palladian movement in the UK. But you often see it is a fantastically grand style for exteriors. But commentators like Horace Walpole, who's quite a famous political commentator in the 18th century, he says that the Palladian style is quite a clunky and unsuitable style for any distinguished interior. And I can't disagree with him, because you think of, I look at the saloon at Claydon, and I see the saloon at Claydon is a monumental room with these monumental pediments and Corinthian order. And then you go into the next room, which is the withdrawing room, the library, and you see a much more delicate approach. And this is what I think of as the key difference between neoclassical and Palladian, is that with the discovery of Pompeii and Herculaneum, you get this almost refinement and going back to its roots of this movement to recreate classical architecture and interiors. So you get they discover how they painted their interiors with these delightful sort of arabesque designs and these neoclassical motifs that are heavily used by, for example, the neoclassical architect and interior designer Robert Adam, who is a Scottish architect who starts working in the 1760s in first Scotland and then in England, and he really refines this style, and he's seen as one of the greatest, British architects of the 18th century for really taking this Palladian style, using the new knowledge gained from these discoveries of Herculaneum and Pompeii, and really transforming these styles to make them, to give these interiors a sort of a more authentic approach. And it also happens, by this time, a lot of, the country was growing a bit weary of this grand Palladian style. You start to get sort of more freer, sort of more eccentric movements, like you think of the Rococo movement, which starts in France, starts to make its way over to Britain in the middle of the 18th century, and has sort of its own moment before almost you combine the frivolity of the Rococo movement with the grandeur of Palladian, combine it with these authentic discoveries in Pompeii and Herculaneum, and suddenly you have, Robert Adams' neoclassical style. I hope that makes sense.
Perfect sense. I do want to talk real briefly. I'll just give a quick history of Pompeii and Herculaneum, because that's important. A lot of people typically don't know about Herculaneum unless they start.
Yeah.
But 79 AD, southern Italy, we're talking, if we don't know what happened in Pompeii, Mount Vesuvius erupted. And what that eruption did was essentially completely bury the city of Pompeii and the city of Herculaneum. The discovery of Pompeii, we're talking when was it? 1700s?
So my understanding is that Herculaneum was discovered first in, I want to say 1763 off the top of my head, with Pompeii coming a bit later, but Herculaneum was discovered first.
So Pompeii, as it stands right now, I've been very fortunate to go to Pompeii several times. I've also been to Herculaneum. Pompeii is on the outskirts of Naples, and the archaeological site there is massive, and it doesn't really interfere with anything besides the Mount Vesuvius landscape. So they are still, and they've undug maybe half of Pompeii, probably less. So they continue every day to make discoveries in Pompeii that inform us on life in ancient Rome. Remember, we're talking 79 AD, in not a flash, but basically, I suppose maybe a couple of days, I don't know, volcanoes, the city was gone, buried completely. So what happened with Pompeii that preserved it was, if you look at ancient Roman images of Vesuvius, it only has one. But if you look at Vesuvius today, it has two. And if you're there and you can imagine the scope and size of that volcano, how much mountain had to get blown into the air and then rain down on this city to bury it in ash and soot, to preserve that, it's terrifying. It's terrifying. But also, on the other side of the volcano, it happened differently in Herculaneum. The only issue is Herculaneum is now right in the middle of Naples. So you can't tear down part of the city of Naples to uncover any more of Herculaneum. However, the way I understand it, Herculaneum got the lava flow that Pompeii did. And the lava flow mixed with the earthquakes, which caused the rivers to swell, mixed and made a molten mud. So Herculaneum was basically consumed by a molten mud that preserved its structures, roofing. Most roofing in Pompeii is destroyed because boulders and heavy ash and soot fell and buried it. from bottom up. But Herculaneum was buried by a wall of molten lava. But the horrible part about that is the people in Pompeii typically died from poisonous gas that rolled out of the volcano. Most of them were suffocated before they were buried. But in Herculaneum, there were mass graves huddled at the port because people were literally running from walls of molten lava, and it eventually buried them and seared them alive, which is just the worst thing to think about. So that's my little bit on Pompeii and Herculaneum, but also why we have those discoveries is because they were preserved from the volcano. But now this is where we need to start to think about what Renaissance is and what neoclassical architecture and art is, and what Palladian art in this almost neoclassical period and how they're different. The Renaissance operates on what it thinks is classical antiquity because they didn't have all the resources that the neoclassical period had. So tell me if I've got this right, G. So referencing Palladio for architecture is more like referencing a Roman architecture based on what was thought to be Roman architecture, where neoclassical architecture tends to operate from a more true model, given discoveries that happened between the end of the Renaissance and the start of the neoclassical period. Did I get that right?
Absolutely. Especially, Palladio and the architects who, used Roman architecture in the Renaissance, they had access to what was there, so with, grand public architecture, you can get that spot on. But when it comes to designing home, sort of that sort of domestic, particularly interior architecture, that is something that, you find that they take the elements that they know and they understand, and they try to translate them into sort of interiors and into sort of smaller spaces, and with varying success. And then you see sort of the discovery in Pompeii and Herculaneum, and you see, oh, these interiors sometimes they're a lot more simple. They involve a lot more painted elements. They're not, then you see cartoons of Roman sort of architecture or anything Roman, and everything is columns and pillars and pediments and porticos and all that, when really that is the sort of the grandest and most extreme form of Roman architecture that wouldn't have been sort of there every day. But exactly as you say, that's what the Renaissance scholars had access to, and that was their understanding at the time.
It makes me think of even in the neoclassical period. I'm just going to take one step away from architecture for a second. In the Renaissance, they did not know that for Roman and Greek sculpture that are all white marble typically, or bronze, but the white marble sculptures would have been clothed and painted. So a lot of Renaissance sculpture, such as the famous Michelangelo's David, would be completely white, is completely white, and was never painted, even though classical sculptures were. And when we get to sculpture in the neoclassical period, I can think principally of Antonio Canova. I don't know if you know anything about Canova, but even neoclassical sculpture is still done white and unpainted, because even by the neoclassical period, they didn't have all of the archaeological tools to realize, wait a minute, there's pigment here that we can detect with modern technology. Now we know that if we're looking at a classical sculpture or a bust or anything like this, that there would have been color to them. But both the Renaissance and neoclassical sculpture got that wrong. And I don't think there's really many people today doing classical Greek painted sculptures. None that I know of. So I guess a last important question is the political implications tied to using a Palladian architecture in England, or referencing classical architecture. It doesn't have to be Palladian explicitly, but what does that provide on for a political scope?
I think I think you can really, it's quite an interesting question, and you can really use the history of this classical revival in architecture in the UK at this time and use it to paint a picture of the sort of the political narrative of the UK, you could say. I mean, I feel it is no coincidence that the year 1715 is the most pivotal. That is the year that Giacomo Leone translates I Quattro Libri. That is the year that Colin Campbell publishes Vitruvius Britannicus. It is also the year of the first, what we call Jacobite rebellion. For those who aren't familiar, that I realise that 18th century British history is a little few steps away from the Italian Renaissance, but I will do my best. So throughout the 17th century, the ruling family of Britain was the Scottish Stuart family. Towards the end of the century, the King James II was known for his Catholicism in a time when Britain was a very, very staunchly Protestant country. He was overthrown and his daughter took over, and he and his very newborn son fled to France, where they live. And so you'd think that was the end of the story. James's two daughters, first Mary II and then Queen Anne, ruled England. The problem was when Anne dies in 1714, and she is succeeded by her German cousin George I, which is quite a few sort of generations away from the Stuarts. And so you suddenly have this surge of Catholics in England thinking, I don't think that we should be ruled by this other dynasty. I think we should bring back James and his son. The Latin name for James being Jacobite, Jacob, which is where Jacobite comes from. And so to make this, I realize I may have gone off on a bit of a tangent, but the classical architecture was almost used by the government set up by King George to almost sort of present this sort of facade of stability and grandeur. It then became heavily associated with what's known as the Whig Party, roughly equivalent to, you'd think of sort of a liberal party today. The Liberals supported George, the Tories, which is the Conservatives, supported the Jacobites and the Catholics. I'm simplifying it quite a bit, but this new sort of Whig Party and this new royal dynasty used this sort of new classical architecture as a way of sort of celebrating itself. And you have a period of Whig rulership ruling over the country, with Robert Walpole becoming the first prime minister of the UK in that period, and building his own country house in his own house, Houghton Hall in Norfolk, was originally designed by Colin Campbell himself, who published Vitruvius Britannicus, and it features in Vitruvius Britannicus. Vitruvius Britannicus was essentially Colin Campbell's sort of self-promotion catalogue for getting other people to design and have him design houses for them. But you do have this period of stability, which is supported by this very stable sense of Roman and Palladian architecture. And it is only in 1760 when King George III takes over, and you see a final break away from the Whigs. The Whig party essentially shatters into a million different factions, and they're all competing with each other, and they never have the same hold on government as they did before. And that coincides with the fall of fashion of this Palladian style, which by that point is considered to be very stark, very sort of imperialistic and not plain, but very austere. And the transition to a more sort of not frivolous, but a more decorated, a more sympathetic, a more aesthetically pleasing and softer style, which is how the neoclassical style develops in relation to that. And I hope that makes a little bit of sense.
Yeah, I think that was a great answer. I think it's a great answer. We see a lot the emulating Roman architecture to create a sense of monumental power, or to make implications about yourself in relation to the origin of the architecture, be it like a Roman imperial sense that you might find during the Renaissance, but also in this Palladian style, as you said. I think that's really interesting. I never thought about neoclassical as softening that. I think that's interesting, making it more refined. I think it's interesting that you said that.
Yeah, very, very much so. Again, it goes back to that idea of making it more authentic, refining it, improving what you had before, using the new knowledge to improve upon something. This very much the case with the neoclassical style that emerges. So
I guess let's do a brief summary of kind of what we went over and why it matters. I think that's always important. Like, why are we talking about this? I'm constantly refining my definition of what the Renaissance is. And thinking about the Renaissance, a Renaissance style, from an architect as important as Palladio, among the most important Italian Renaissance architects that we know of, to find his style in 18th century England, right? I always got to do that math. I got to jump up to 1700. I'm always like, wait a second. And to realize that Renaissance architecture is continuing to live centuries later in a kind of a new guise, right? It's got a different purpose. It functions differently, but is visually recognizable. But then it's also something that we have to hit up against the contemporary style that would be neoclassical, right? That would we say neoclassical as contemporary to like English Palladian, or as like a result of?
That is quite an interesting question, because I feel as though, although I would say that the neoclassical style is a result of and a successor of, I think it is very important to understand that with architectural style, it's not as though, everyone was building in one specific Palladian style up until a certain date, and then everyone moved over to neoclassical. They lived with each other, and they, some, Palladian houses are built sort of well into the 18th century, and even some neoclassical styles still are heavily referencing, particularly exteriors. I feel like the neoclassical movement is a much stronger interior movement, whereas the exteriors, the influence of Palladio and Vitruvius, still permeates and still in the exterior building of country houses. So I think it is a successor. It's an evolution, but they are. I don't think you can really separate them, if that makes any sense.
No, I think that's a great answer. I have one more question for you, but it's not very related, and I didn't give you a warning about this one. But okay. Before I do that, is there anything left on your mind or on your brain that you want to say about this? I think we've covered it really thoroughly, but I just want to make sure before we conclude that we've turned over all the stones that you want to turn over.
I think, honestly, I do feel as though we have pretty much covered everything. I got in my abridged version of early 18th century British royal history, which is always fun to sort of shoehorn in whenever I get the chance. But no, I do. I feel as though I've hopefully been able to offer a different perspective of how sort of this kind of style of architecture can be viewed.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. So in reading about Uppark, I saw that H.G. Wells was once a resident there.
Yes.
And also that his mother became a housekeeper there.
Yes.
So in the vein of H.G. Wells and not thinking at all about the Renaissance, Neoclassical, or the British country house, do you think that there's intelligent life beyond us in the universe?
Do you know what? I think that the combination of events that had to occur to make life on Earth, it's incredibly special. But then I think Earth and our solar system and the sun and our galaxy are only such a small, minute part of the universe. I think it would be incredibly egocentric of us as, Earth dwellers to think that we are the only possible way of intelligent life being created in the entire universe. I think there has to be something out there somewhere. I don't necessarily think it would take on a form that we would expect, but I think it would be incredibly narrow-minded for anyone to think that we are alone in the universe.
That was a great answer. I think all it takes is a trip to the supermarket to know we cannot be the most intelligent thing. All right. Well, I imagine that the listeners are giving you a silent round of applause. Thank you so much for being the first guest on the Italian Renaissance podcast. And I'm really glad that we got to expand to your scope of expertise. I think the listenership is really going to appreciate your contribution to this. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I hope you've all enjoyed listening to me ramble on. And I hope, understanding sort of the influence of the Renaissance extends, well into my special area of expertise, which is the corner of 18th century England.
Let's wave goodbye to viewers and give a silent wave to listeners. Ciao tutti.